Hello, this video I'm going to show you how to make these posh peg bags, which are cone shaped and quilted and pieced. We're going to do a French seam for the back seam, and I'm going to show you how to put the binding on without using a bias binder or hand stitching. It will all be done on the sewing machine. We have kits for this. So here is the kit, and within the kit you'll find you have got full instructions, which includes a pattern. So this was to show you how to make these step by step with photographs as well. Also within your kit you have a small piece of bias binding for the base. You've got the important carabiner so that you can hang it onto the washing line. You've got your lining fabric, and you've also got your strips of fabric. This is all Lewis and Irene fabrics here, which are 100% cotton, and they're pre-shrunk, so you shouldn't have any problems with them. So in your pack you've got 8 of these strips, which all need to be stitched together, and I stitch using 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way through. Right, so the first job is to make sure that your sewing machine is set for normal sewing, okay, nothing else. And all you need to do is to put your right sides together and stitch all the way down. Once you have got 2 together, like so, open it out and put your 3rd piece underneath, and then you just keep going. It's always right sides together and stitch. Be careful as you're stitching that you are opening these as you go down and they don't get caught up underneath. There's the next one. I'm just now going to continue to whiz through these, and then I'll come back to you as soon as I've finished them. So now we've sewn these all together, what we need to do is press them, and the back seams, as you can see, are all pressed open. This gives us a crisp front, and we're ready to cut. So lay it down, lay your pattern where you want it to go. I tend to put a straight edge against a straight edge. You also need to cut a circle, and you'll see as I lay this pattern out you still have plenty of fabric to do something else. So pin it down and cut it out, and also you need to cut some wadding. Now this wadding that I'm using here is a called bump. It's a curtain lining which works beautifully, and you also need to cut your background. Okay, so once you've got them cut, probably can hear the cockerel in the background. Once you've got them cut, you need to lay them out so that you can start stitching them. So first of all, lay down your wadding. Then if you put your top fabric over the top of that, and then you need to put your backing fabric, which I seem to have mislaid. I'll cut another one. For the backing and the wadding, it is best if you cut them a little bit bigger than the front, because it will move. I don't tend to cut this bit yet because I want to make sure I'm matched before I do. So right sides together, right side of your backing to the right side of your front, and lay them on. Okay, and then put this back on again and draw your circle. These chalk pens are marvellous. They come with a cartridge of different colours. Okay. Then pin it all together and sew this circle. I'm going to go back over to the machine. And you may have noticed it's a different sewing machine than what we started with, and that's because the other one decided to start playing up, so we had to switch machines. Okay, so we're just going to sew around that circle now. And then we're going to cut it out. Not with those scissors, we're not though. Long ones. You need to leave approximately 1/4 of an inch between your cutting and your stitching, because we need to make little nicks all the way around so that it lays flat. So literally just nick all the way around. Try not to snip into your stitches, because if you do, you'll have a bit of a problem. It's not something that isn't repairable, because we are now going to top stitch over this. Okay. Once you've done that, you pull your backing fabric through. Get it to lay nice and flat. Like so. And give it a good press. Just so that it's nice and flat. And once you've done that, you're ready to sew the next bit. So this one, as you can see, I have cut this top piece out, and my wadding and my backing are much bigger than the front. You need to do the same thing for the base. This time you're going to have your base fabric, your lining fabric face down, then put your wadding, and then put your top fabric faced up. When it goes on, it'll end up going in that way. So I'll now show you how to sew them. Set your sewing machine onto a walking foot if you've got it, or onto the walking mechanisms that you've got with whatever machine you have. But don't worry if you don't have it. Make sure that you've got a new needle in, because this will blunt the needle quite rapidly, and set your stitch to a bit bigger than normal. And what we're going to do is we're going to start stitching here, and we're going to go round and then just keep working our way out. Make sure you've got plenty of thread ready, and make sure that you've got your bobbins ready. So the first thing we're going to do is top stitch, and here's a top tip. On this foot here I've got 2 markers there, and when I'm top stitching I will keep this outer piece of this fabric here on that line, so that I end up with a very nice even top stitch. I want that to stay in. As I'm going round, it's easier with an extension table on. But the extension table for this machine's packed away at the moment. As we come round here, we're going to move out so that this line of stitching will be on the edge of this foot. You don't have to do yours that way, you can do it as wide as you like, but that's the way I like to work. So I'm moving out now, and as you can see, that line of stitching is at the edge of the foot. And we're going to just keep going round. I have recommended in your pattern that you pin this, but I know this is going to move, so that's why I've got so much fabric underneath. changing that because it's telling me it's about to run out, and I don't want to run out on a blue bit where it's more noticeable. As you can see, as we're coming around, it's nice and even because we're using the foot as a guide. Doesn't take too long to do. When you're used to doing it. can see where it's moving. You don't have to quilt them as much as I do, but I prefer all this quilting on them. I think that's a nicer finish. You can also use the stitches that you've got on your machine instead of a straight stitch, like your patterned ones. Sure why that's done that. Naughty. Last bit on this one, and then we'll do the base. And there it is, quilted. So now that we've got our top done, we're now going to work on the base, and to start with we're going to sew right on this very edge all the way round, and then as we did here we're going to start spiraling in till we get to the middle. This is easier than starting in the middle and working out, in my opinion. So, stitching right on the edge. start to come in. And again, I'm going to go to the width of the foot. Come to a pin and we stop before it goes underneath the foot, because what we don't want to do is break our needle. Have it. So now we're going to trim them, and I'm going to get a proper pair of scissors to do that. Just flip it over and check the back, making sure that you've got no white bits showing like we have here. So we'll just trim that little tiny bit off there, and that's good to go. And then we do the same with this. Have a top and a bottom ready for the next stage. And the next thing I'm going to show you is how to do a French seam, which you may think is a bit weird once we get going, It is a bit weird, I have to admit, but it's good fun. So in your pack you'll have a piece of bias binding. They're all different colours, whichever pack you've bought, and they're all shop bought. I particularly like these. These are a cotton one, which are lovely. And you need to cut approximately 6 inches off it, because this is going to be the tab for the top. And all you need to do, fold it in half and stitch down that edge right up against the edge. And then wonder why it's not moving. What's going on here? That's it. There we go, just stitch right on the very edge. And this needle is getting blunt already, as you can hear, and that was a new needle when we first started. So you've now made your tab that's going to go on the top. The next thing that we're going to do is a French seam. The weirdest thing about this is normally you would sew with right sides together. For a French seam you start with the wrong sides together, and we are going to stitch all the way down there, right as close to the edge as you can. If you can't pin this, I recommend you get some of these lovely clips. You just clip it all together. And then as you're sewing down it, you put them off. Brilliant. I do like a gadget, and we will talk gadgets as I use them. And these are brilliant instead of pins. Okay, so all we're going to do now is stitch right down, starting on the very top at the very edge, the same as if we were top stitching. No danger of getting these caught underneath the foot, so no danger of breaking needles. That's the first part of your French seam done. Turn it inside out. Next gadget is a pokey tool. Poke that through. Okay, don't worry about all these loose ends, we'll sort that out nearer the time. And what we're now going to do is sew all the way down here again, anything between 1/4 and 1/2 inch down that seam. Now I'm used to doing this, so I know whether I'm going to catch this in or not when I'm sewing down there. You can feel it. If you feel along, you need to be stitching, if you go along there where it's not so lumpy, okay, because you're going to catch that piece of seam in, and that's the whole point of it. A ridiculously large pair of scissors for that, Anita. But before we do that, we have to put our tab in. So fold your tab in half. The seam that you've stitched needs to come to this seam. Now this is me being picky, but I think it looks better. And you poke the folded end into that hole, so the raw ends are sticking out, and the stitched edge is against this seam here. Just center it, and then we're going to sew from here across. So we're going from this folded edge across to here. We will then go back and come back again. This is securing this. Needle down and whiz that around, and now start to sew down here. Thinking, why on earth is she using white thread? It's so you can see it. That's the reason that I'm doing that. So snip that off, and turn it through, and this is where you're going to find out if you've messed up your French seam or not. Give that a little bit of a tug. So we now have our tab. Then check your seam. Check it all the way down. You should not be able to see any raw edge through that seam, on that side or on that side, and this is your French seam. So that's that bit done. Now all that's left to do is to put the base onto here, and I recommend where you've got your seam, you fold that across there to find this piece here. Just make a small nick, then match that nick to this seam. So that's nick to seam there, and come across here and do the same thing here. And then do the same thing there. You now have 4 little nicks in that. Then on here, fold that over. Small nick there. Work your way round. Don't let go of it so that you don't have it even. Small nick there. Open it out. Put the 2 nicks together this time and come round. One out of there. Put the 2 nicks together again and come round the other side. Take that one out of there. So now you've got 4 little nicks, and we're going to attach this to here. So I always start opposite the seam because the seam's really bulky. So decide which way this is going to go and find one of these. So we're putting a nick to a nick, and again we have our valuable clips. Then go opposite, so the opposite nick will now come to this seam. Fold it flat, so there's your seam. Fold it flat and make sure that that nick is on the stitching. Then find the next ones, bring them together, and we are going to be using a lot of clips on this. which is far easier than pins, because when you're sewing around this, the pins tend to stick into you and they do hurt. Okay, so now we're manoeuvring this in. It should go in quite easily. If you find that you've got one bit that's a little bit bigger than another, just move it along a bit, just ease it in, but it should go in easily enough, like that. Okay, and again this side, it should just pop in. Okay, so that's where we are now, and as you can see, your peg bag's coming on quite nicely. So the next stage is sewing around the bottom, and the first thing we're going to do is literally sew this edge around to keep it together before we start putting the binding on. This is also the time where, if you've got a label that you've where to say that you've made it and it is yours, you'll sew this as you come round. I always start at the back, and I always start, I sew it this way, which you may think is a bit weird, but this is the way I sew it, and I sew from this side of the seam. So just get it under the machine and start sewing. This raw edge won't be seen as we're coming round, because this is why we're going to bind it. When you get to the end and you know you're coming up to that big seam, go over it very slowly. Don't go running over it as quick as you can, because you could break a needle. And I am talking from experience. So just encourage it over, nice and slow. Have the base attached. So all that we've got left to do now is the bias binding. So I've just stitched on my tab, and now we're going to attach our bias binding to this. First thing that you need to do with your bias binding is open it out and fold the end over. Then this side here we're going to keep open. We're going to stitch in that seam. So you see where that's pressed. So just again, open it out, fold it over, and then we're going to stitch in there all the way round. Okay, and we're going to do it on the bottom first. Again, I'm going to start where the seam is. I'm starting on this side of the seam. I'll probably come round a little bit more because it is quite bulky, and just so. Take your time doing this. Put the edge of the bias binding to the edge of your peg bag and stitch. Don't pull it, because it will just distort it when you go to turn it over. And if you've got a bias binding machine and you're very good at doing circles, you can whiz round these quite quickly. But equally they can move out of it at the same time, so be careful. Because it's a continuous circle. Coming to the end now, and what you have to do when we get to the end is sew straight over our nice little neat bit. Remember, we've got this big bulky seam here. We're adding another layer of fabric to it, so we do need to be careful. We need to walk over it gently. So I now need to know where I'm coming to. So I'm just going to snip that there. You see, I'm going to come straight over here. So that will lay flat, and we're coming round over that edge, which will give us a nice finish. So gently over the seam, and then come round. And you'll now see that you have a nice finish there, as we're going to sew again. Now at this point you might think this is all a bit bulky and I want to trim it. I do sometimes trim them, and I am going to trim this to show you. I'm just going to come around here just to take a tiny bit off. You don't have to do this, but I don't like to have a bulky edge. Mainly because it makes life a lot easier as you're stitching it. We've got just that tiny bit there. Okay, so now we're going to turn it over and top stitch it down. And once you've done that, you will have your finished piece. Okay, so start wherever you feel comfortable starting. I just need to snip that threads off. So I'm going to start here. And I'm using the guide on this foot. So you see that red bit there is the guide on the foot. Keeping this nice and flat. We're just coming round. Make sure as you're sewing round it, you're not pulling anything and you're keeping everything flat, which is key for when you're putting bias binding on. Otherwise you'll end up with all sorts of wrinkles in it. You can hear this needle's a bit clunky because it's blunt already. It's going through a lot of fabric. It's also going through a man-made lining, or wadding should I say. If you haven't pulled it, you'll find it will just sit nicely as you come round to this last bit. Trim your edges off, pull her out. All that needs to be done is attach your carabiner and your peg bag is ready for use. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much for watching.